Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video. In this video, finally getting around to doing one of the bigger Survivor rankings I still want to do that's left on the board, and that is to rank every cast in the history of Survivor US. Now I'll be honest, I did very much struggle with creating the criteria for this list, where there was a debate over how do I approach it. Do I approach it from a gameplay perspective of which cast has the highest level of gameplay? Do I approach it from a legacy perspective, like which cast had the biggest impact on the history of the show? Do I go from a character perspective and just straight up how entertaining these people are? Like, there are many ways to approach this cast ranking here, and I kind of decided on a mix of all of it. And through that, there will probably be some arbitrary placements here and there, as again, there's just so much to assess with these casts. But I do think a video for down the road will probably be one where I rank every cast based on their overall game ability. I think that could definitely be an interesting video. But really, I feel like overall game ability is probably actually the least important of the criteria here, where again, I think character and legacy and importance to the series is definitely going to play a greater factor here. But with that, let's jump right into it. Let's jump into the ranking. There are 42 casts to be ranking here. So let's start off at number 42. The bottom ranked cast for me is one that I was disappointed that has to be this low, but there's just so many duds on this cast that I cannot ignore it, and that is Survivor Fiji. And again, it's weird to have it here. Obviously, this is a cast that is technically the most diverse cast in the history of the show, and that's obviously something to be applauded, especially from all the way back in season 14. But I mean, there are so many duds on this cast. Like, so many of the early boots bring nothing to the table. You got Jessica DeBen, you got Erica, you got like a Rita, you got Liliana. I mean, even Papa Smurf doesn't bring much to the table. I mean, really, the only early boot for me that is somewhat interesting is Sylvia. I always really liked Anthony, but even in the post-merge, we got some people who don't bring much entertainment to the show. I mean, Cassandra is kind of just there. Stacy isn't that interesting. Edgardo doesn't really get much to do. And then even some of the better characters in Rocky and Lacey have some ickiness surrounding them in the way they treated other people. And even Earl, the winner of this season, who plays a really strong game, isn't the most riveting TV. So through that, we're left with what? Yao Man, who is obviously an all-time great character. And then Dreams, who has like a fascinating arc across the season. And then I guess Alex, and that's really it. To me, it's like there's just too many duds to ignore on this cast. That despite there being some glimpses of great characters, I mean, that's pretty much every season. So I do feel like this is the worst of the bunch here, and it lands at number 42. Now at 41, kind of a similar thing. We're moving on to a season further back, and that is Survivor Thailand. And the one saving grace for Thailand to me is the amount of dark humor that comes from the season. And a lot of that comes from its cast. I mean, someone like a Clay Jordan, despite him making some questionable comments at points, is also really funny on the show. Through him saying like, "No shit Sherlock" to Jan, or him writing down "Bye Bye Denver Diva." He obviously ends up being a fantastic character there. Brian Heideck ends up being an interesting villain for the show in a way that I don't feel like the show's really seen up until that point. Helen Glover ends up being a really fun character as well. Sheehan has a really interesting storyline across the season, has a really fun downfall. Rob with two B's is incredible, probably one of the best pre-merge characters of all time. But again, we still have some pretty big non-factors along the way. Someone like a Tanya, who was sick and didn't really get to do much. Someone like an Aaron, who was kind of just there. Even Penny, until her last few episodes, was a non-factor. Stephanie, Dill, and Jed both didn't really get much to truly do there either. Even Ken, who I feel like comes off as a more notable figure, being this New York police officer, being well respected for 9/11, also like not much to really do on the season. So I do think Helen and Clay, and then probably like Shannon Robber, really great casting choices there. Like most of the other ones are very middling, and because that, Thailand lands here at number 41. Now number 40, we're getting into a more recent season. We had the lowest ranked season that has returnees on it, and at number 40, we do have Survivor Caramoan. And I just don't get what they were going with on this cast. Like, obviously, I get from the favorites' point of view, they were trying to get people that would have drama. They got Philip and Francesca. They got Brandon Hans back. It's like, I get where they were going for, but it's also terrible. Like, it's also not good casting decisions, especially with how the season ends up playing out as well. But then even beyond those more inherently bad choices there. You even have someone like a Brenda and an Eric who really don't bring much to the table on the season. The Fans is one of the worst tribes in the history of the show from an entertainment standpoint in my eyes. There's so many unmemorable figures there. People like a Julia Landauer, and you got Hope and Allie, and even like a Laura, who I always thought was a player that had potential. She doesn't really bring that much to the show. Shamar takes up a lot of the screen time on that tribe and is just not that likable of a presence either. Again, to me, there's like so many duds from both tribes in a season where the favorite should inherently be a group of good, interesting people, but it just isn't. And they did a terrible job at casting the favorites here. And with the Fans not being able to support it either, it really is a terrible cast. For me, it lands at number 40. Number 39, we're going in to a cast I don't think is the worst in the world in terms of having interesting characters here and there, but it is one of the worst casts gameplay-wise, especially in the more modern era. And here we do have Survivor One World, where obviously from it we have Kim Spradlin, one of the most dominant winners of all time, but also with that we get a lot of people who don't bring anything to the game, but despite that we still get some good characters here. I mean, Sabrina was a fun presence on the show, Troyzan was a fun presence, Tarzan is a fun presence, Jonas is even fun. I think you get some ickiness from Alicia and obviously Colton, which makes them a bit of a mixed bag. But I mean, Kat is like a fine character, but the rest of the cast is simply just not really the greatest. I mean, there's a lot of like unmemorable early boots. You got like a Matt Quinlan, a Bill Posley, Nina, a Courtney Moon. Even Monica Culpepper on this season is not super memorable. Leaf is here. Michael Jefferson is here. It's like a pretty weak field, though about half the cast is like extremely weak, and then the other half is fine. But to me, there was never really a true standout character from this season, someone that encapsulates the entire season. I feel like when you think of One World, you think of Kim, which is not for character or entertainment reasons, because of gameplay. So for me, again, the cast of One World itself is pretty weak. It's here at number 39. Now, number 38, we're moving on to a cast that is another very high variance one, but there's an all-time great character here that does hog up way too much of the screen time, but it does kind of elevate it above the last few we've talked about. And at number 38, we do have Survivor Samoa. And obviously here we have Russell Hantz. And Russell Hantz in Samoa is one of the greatest characters of all time. Just such riveting TV across this season, but to the detriment of a lot of other figures. I feel like out of the pre-merge boots, outside of Russell Swan, no one there is particularly memorable. And if they are, it's for negative reasons, like Ben Browning. I mean, you got like the Betsies, Marisas, Liz Kims, Ashley Trainers, Yasmin. They're all pretty forgettable figures in Survivor history. And when we get to the post-merge, still pretty forgettable figures in like a Kelly Sharbaugh and a Mick and even Natalie White. If Natalie White did not win this season, she would have been super forgettable. But I mean, we do still have some standouts along the way. I mean, obviously Shambo is a massive character. I've always liked Jason. Laura Moret brings a lot to the table here. Eric Cardona is even a fun character at points. Dave Ball is fantastic. Like, there are great characters here. I do think a lot of the issue of this season is obviously the editing, the fact that Russell Hantz was so greatly favored to where the rest of the cast just didn't get their time to shine. But I don't think it's a bad cast entirely, though how the season edited them was definitely not ideal. But I still feel like the greatness of Russell Hantz still elevates it above the last few people and is here at number 38. Now, at 37, we have another really top-heavy cast where outside the top few people, it's a decent amount of duds on this cast, but it's still enough to land it. At 37, we have Palau. Again, Palau has so many duds. The original Oolong tribe, so many of those people are so forgettable. You got like Jeff and Kim and Ashley Ashby. If Jonathan Libby didn't get like purged out of the game, he would have been super forgettable. Even like an Ibrahim doesn't really get that much screen time despite being in the final 3 of Oolong. And really a lot of Koror doesn't even get that much screen time until the post-merge because Oolong is taking up so much of the screen time for them. That being said though, again, obviously iconic characters in Tom and Stephanie on this season. Ian is also a very fascinating character across season. Katie Gallagher, fantastic character. Kobe is fun. Bobby John's fine. James Miller is a really fun character. So again, there are standouts here, but there are your fair share of duds as well, to where again, I think it's another cast kind of in line with Samoa and it being a top heavy cast with a good chunk of duds. And because that lands here at number 37. Now, number 36, we're moving on back to an old school season of the show, and is really a cast that I've never gelled with, even though I feel like the general consensus on this is that it's a good cast, and that is the cast of Survivor the Amazon. And again, I think this is another one, like similar to Samoa. I think Rob Cesternino makes this season. I mean, Rob Cesternino is the biggest character and the most prominent character on this season by quite a bit. I think if you take Rob Cesternino out of it, I think this is a very mediocre cast. Like, while there are fun little characters here and there, I don't think there's anyone else that truly makes this season stand out. I mean, Jen and Heidi are fine, like really fun as these like villainous figures at this point in the show, with Heidi getting this big like dodo edit that is fun. But again, outside of that, it's like you have like Butch has some fun character moments. I guess you could say the same thing about Matthew. I mean, Dina is interesting, Alex Bell's fine, but again, not to a point where they're really like the characters of the season. Roger is kind of an icky figure at this point. I think pretty much all of the pre-merge boots are pretty big duds. I mean, I guess Dan Liu is somewhat notable, but almost everyone else, it's like, who is Jean? Who is Janet? Who is Joanna? I mean, none of these people are super memorable. So again, I think that the Amazon cast for me is one that's a bit overstated. I never personally clicked with it. And again, without Rob Cesternino, I don't think this is a good cast at all. So for me, it lands here at number 36. Number 35, moving on to a similar cast with a similar theme, and that is Survivor Vanuatu. And I think the same thing of Vanuatu. I mean, there are probably more notable figures here. I mean, like Eliza is an all-time great character. Chris obviously has a really interesting run and ends up being super notable. Amy Cusick is a great villain. Twyla obviously brings a lot to the table. Julie Berry is like kind of like the start of this like Parvati archetype that becomes prominent afterwards. I've always personally really liked Sarge and Rory as characters, but beyond that, I mean, this is not a great cast. I mean, again, the entire pre-merge group of players, all the young guys booted from the men tribe, really forgettable. Most of the women, I mean, you got like Lisa Kiefer. I mean, Dolly's not particularly memorable. Mia probably makes more of an impact, but is also still not super memorable. I mean, it really is a mediocre group of pre-merge boots, to where even in the post-merge, like someone like a Chad and even Leanne don't get massive edits either. So again, another very mixed cast, but I do think Chris, Eliza, and Amy in particular do elevate it above the Amazon for me. So it's here at number 35. Number 34 is a season that I've always really liked, but again, it's too inconsistent of a cast to put too much higher. And here we do have Survivor Guatemala. And again, like from Guatemala, I mean, you got Judd, who is an all-time great character. The arc of Stephanie across the season is really interesting. And then you have Rafe, who is also another really interesting figure. Outside of that, I mean, I think you're looking at like a Gary is fun. Bobby John certainly has his impact here. And then Jamie also has a big impact. Almost everyone else doesn't bring that much to the show. I mean, Danny Boatwright is severely under-edited here. Lydia has some fun moments, but not super memorable. Same thing goes with like a Cindy. Same thing goes with a Brandon. Same thing goes with like an Amy O'Hara. Brian Corden is a memorable early boot, but again, still not to any extreme. And then we got a slew of super forgettable figures in Jim and Morgan and Brianna and Brooke and even Margaret. And it's like so many of those early boots are just not memorable. And because that, tough to put it much higher, especially when a lot of the end gamers also don't get proper edits. But it is the greatness of Judd and then the Steph Rafe duo that does leave it as high as it is here at number 34. Number 33, moving on to another cast that I think is probably a little bit more consistent, but is also looked at as a bit of a train wrecky season. And here at number 33, we do have Survivor Gabon. And again, Gabon's a massive train wrecky season to the point where you do have Sugar, you do have like a Randy, you have a Corinne, Crystal are good TV. I've always liked Ace as a pre-merge boot. Outside that, again, like it's a lot of fine figures, but not a lot of all-time great characters. I mean, like the early boots and like Michelle, Jillian, a Dan, Paloma, a Kelly, like they all have moments, but like not to where they're super memorable on their show. Even Bob is pretty under-edited and really only is memorable just because he's old. Susie has her moments, but even then, not a big edit for her. Maddie is kind of just fine as a character, and I guess same thing goes with like a Charlie and a Marcus. Again, it's a cast to me that like you do have some iconic characters. It's like largely inconsistent. And I think at the end of the day, those characters are probably still not even as compelling as certain figures we've already talked about, like a Rob Cesternino, Russell Hantz, Tom and Steph. So it's like, I do struggle putting it much higher than number 33 here. Now, number 32, we're getting into a cast that I know people talk about as an all-time great cast, and I severely disagree. I actually had this cast lower, until right before I made the video. At number 32, I do have Survivor Cook Islands. And again, it is a cast that is super top-heavy. You have Yule, you have Ozzy, you have Jonathan Penner, and those are really the top three on this season. I mean, obviously, like, we get returnees later on in Parvati and Candace, but their runs on this season are fine. I mean, Candace is definitely more prominent, and obviously Parvati is memorable for like playing up the flirt card, but it's like they're just fine here. Like, I feel like Nate Gonzalez and Cowboy and even Billy Garcia are probably more notable figures from this season when we take away their returns. And then beyond that, it's like we're getting to a lot of duds on this season. People like Cecilia, people like Flicka, people like Stephanie, Christina Coria, Rebecca, Brad. It's like a lot of these people get no screen time and are just super irrelevant to the season. And again, that is the issue of this season, is how even late into the game, Becky and Sundra get very little content and complexity across the season. It's like, to me, this is just a cast that is so top heavy, but also is left with a lot of non-factors in as well, to where, to me, this cast is just way too inconsistent to really put in too high regard, despite it having some all-time great characters in Penner, Yule, and Ozzy. So because of that, for me, it lands here at number 32. Now, number 31, we're moving on to the most recent cast we've talked about so far. Again, Survivor, for me, I think has typically done a very good job in recent years, especially with newbie casts and picking interesting people. However, I think this is the one massive outlier for me. At number 31, we do have Ghost Island. And I always found the casting of Ghost Island to be very strange, where it definitely feels like a step back from recent seasons up until that point that have had really strong casts. And to be fair, I feel like Ghost Island probably suffers from a bad boot list, where I feel like a lot of the interesting figures were booted early. I mean, people like Jacob Derwin, Stephanie Gonzalez, Stephanie Johnson, Brendan Shapiro, James Lim, even a Bradley. I feel like all of them were really good casting choices. The problem is that after they leave in the pre-merge, we're left with a Seabass and a Jenna and a Libby and an Angela, a Chelsea, like these people who don't really bring much to the show. However, outside of that, again, I feel like this is a very top-heavy cast. You got Dom and Wendell, who are obviously really notable figures there. You got Chris Noble, who is an incredible character across the season. You got Kellen and Michael Yerger, who definitely bring content to the show. And then you have Laurel and Donathan, who I think are also interesting figures here. So it's it's another cast that is very top heavy. To be honest, it's not that dissimilar to me from Cook Islands. I think Cook Islands obviously has more iconic figures, where the Yule, Ozzy, Penner, and later Parvati are all-time great figures for show. Well, like Ghost Island probably only has like Dominic and I guess Wendell, but it's like, I do feel like the people that were booted earlier on Ghost Island had a lot more potential than people booted early on Cook Islands. So for me, that's enough to elevate it here to number 31. Now at number 30, we're moving on to probably one that's a bit controversial, considering I feel like this is one that's talked about as an all-time worst cast. However, I strongly disagree. At number 30, we do have Redemption Island. And I think Redemption Island suffers from the fact that Rob obviously dominates. And I do think the Ometepe tribe as a whole is probably the weaker tribe of the two. However, I think people underestimate the Zapatera tribe. I always found the Zapatera tribe to be an interesting group of people. I think also pretty competent players, particularly like Steve and Mike, with Steve Wright also just kind of being an underrated character too. You also have Ralph, who was a great character at the time. David Murphy was a great character at the time. I've always liked Stephanie Valencia. Obviously, you got Russell Hantz there early on. But then when you get to Ometepe, again, you have Rob. And I think obviously your enjoyment of Philip is definitely something that can factor in here. Again, I've always enjoyed Philip as a TV character, especially on Redemption Island. But I can get if you like absolutely hate Philip, that's also something that can knock Redemption Island down. And then beyond that, again, you got like the Ashley, Natalie, Grant, who are not particularly interesting, even debatably Andrew on this season. But they're not like complete non-factors either. While there are a couple duds like a Sarita and a Krista Klump, I do feel like for the most part, everyone else brings something to the table. Even Francesca, being the first boot, is a massive presence across that premiere. Christina Kell, who is a relatively early boot, again, still also pretty big presence. So yeah, I do think the Redemption Island cast is a bit understated. Largely because the people that were more game savvy were on Zapatera, to which they were outnumbered. But also you still have the element of Bossa Rob just being a fantastic character across the season. And to me, that is the main appeal of Redemption Island, is watching Bossa Rob do what he does and him being able to articulate how he does everything, which is something that I think you rarely see in Survivor US. So yeah, like for me, I always respected the cast of Redemption Island, and because that is here number 30. Now number 29, moving on to a season very similar, and here we do have Survivor South Pacific. Now I will say, I actually think South Pacific has bigger duds than Redemption Island. I mean, South Pacific has like someone like a Rick Nelson making it deep into the game. You got a Whitney and Keith who don't bring much to the table. Early on in the game, you have like an Elise and a Semhar and even a Michaela who don't bring much on their own. But then you also have like fun characters like a Christine and a Stacey Powell. You have Papa Bear, who I always found to be a humorous figure. You get Jim Rice, who I think has always been a bit of an understated character in Survivor history. Cochran obviously plays a major factor here. You got Edna and Brandon Hance, who have interesting arcs across this season. You have Ozzy, who has a fascinating arc and a fascinating downfall at the end. Coach, same thing. Again, really interesting arc across this season. But again, I do feel like Sophie, who ends up winning the season, was under-edited. Albert wasn't the most riveting TV either. And really, I feel like there are probably like bigger lulls in the cast of South Pacific than there is with Redemption Island, though I do think South Pacific utilizes its cast kind of better, particularly in the pre-merge, to where it like slightly elevates it above Redemption Island and lands here at number 29. Number 28, moving on to another season around this point in Survivor history, and here we do have Survivor Nicaragua. And Nicaragua is a season that I've always personally defended. I like the season more than most people. But despite that, I mean, there are their fair share of duds here. I mean, a lot of the Espada tribe is not particularly interesting. People like an Eve, people like a Jill. Even Jimmy Johnson I never found particularly interesting. But, I mean, you do have like Wendy Jo and Jimmy T who have fun downfalls. I always like Tyrone. Dan Lembo obviously brings some moments to the table. But also you get some really notable figures too in Jane, Marty, and Holly. And then from LaFleur, again, you have like the Kelly Purples of the world. You have like Kelly Bruno, who wasn't that interesting. Even Alina didn't bring much to the table by the end of it. But, I mean, you still have Brenda, who was a great villain at the time. You have Nyanka, who was an incredible character. You have Fabio, who's a fun character. Chase and Sash, like, probably aren't the most riveting TV, but did play well-ish. And yeah, like I think it's kind of a mixed bag of a cast. I think the high highs here, obviously Nyanka and Marty and Brenda, and I think they definitely elevate things. But there are their fair share of duds that do make it a bit more of a mixed bag. But at the end of the day, I feel like landing here at number 28 was about right for it. Now, number 27, we're moving on to the first full All-Star season on the list here, which, spoiler alert, most All-Star seasons are going to be very high on this list. However, this one I could not justify putting too highly, mainly because of the overall structure of the cast. And also, I don't feel like the season utilizes its cast particularly well. And that season is Survivor Game Changers. And again, like on paper, this is not a bad cast. I mean, you have the likes of Tony, Malcolm, Sandra, Sierra, JT. The problem is that they're all gone early. And then by the time the merge, the only big name we really have left is Suri and Ozzy, I guess. And really, that's obviously the biggest issue with this cast is the overall structuring of it. The fact that there's probably like 7 or 8 big threats coming into the season, but the remainder are mostly non-threats. People that weren't coming into the season with big targets. People like a Brad Culpepper and a Sarah Lucina and a Troy Zan and Sierra Dawn Thomas and a Haley Ford and like some of these other people who are not looked at as major threats in the game coming this season, that I think obviously greatly harms the season as it makes these bigger threats targets early on and leads to them going out one after the other. That being said, I do feel like someone like a Brad Culpepper has a really great arc across the season. Sarah Lucina obviously plays really well towards the end, and you get Ty, Aubrey, and Suri in the end game, who were some of the bigger names. But again, I feel like this season also has an issue of not utilizing its cast properly, where I feel like this is a season that is mostly lacking of fun. And to be fair, I think the Zeke Varner situation obviously factors into that, through that in itself being an icky situation, but I think also through that they wanted to tone down the like villainous elements of Sarah's win to not give a super unlikable winner on a season that also had that situation play out. But I think through that, again, like I think Sarah could have been a much more interesting figure had they shown her go all out as a villain. And I really feel like this is a cast that is technically better on paper than the placement I'm putting it at, but because of how underutilized the cast was and also how messed up the formation of the cast was, I do have to leave it here at number 27. Number 26, we're moving on to another more recent season, but another one that is mostly known for having a mediocre cast, though another one that does have some major standouts from it, and that cast is San Juan del Sur. And obviously here again, like this is a season that has some great returnees from it. Obviously we get Natalie Anderson, we get Jeremy, we get Kelly Wentworth, Keith Nail, yet all returnees that have major factors on future seasons. And even on this season, like Natalie and Jeremy are two of the biggest characters here. Keith is also a big character, but it's like Kelly Wentworth was like a nothing figure here. You also get some duds in like a Julie McGee. Alec and Wes both didn't bring that much to the table, though to be fair, they both have like little fun character moments here and there. But I mean, I feel like there are some pretty notable figures, even in the pre-merge. I mean, John Rocker brought some entertainment to the show. Drew Christie is one of the all-time great pre-merge boots. Josh was a great character early on. Reed becomes a big character in the post-merge. John Mish also becomes a big character. So yeah, it's definitely a cast that has its highs, has its lows, but I mean, it is a cast that also has some iconic figures that come back later on that kind of makes it similar to me than Cook Islands. But I think the thing that elevates is I think the players that play less of a factor on the season, even in itself, are more notable, and the people like Avell and Nadia, and again Alec and Wes, and even a Dale Wentworth has his moments, to where I don't feel that Cook Islands has those for its lesser members. So because that for me, San Juan del Sur lands here at number 26. Number 25, and we're actually going to be on a streak here of older school seasons. We're actually going to blow through most of the remaining old school seasons all in a row here. Starting at number 25, this may actually be controversial considering I feel like this is normally talked about as one of the better casts of all time. At 25, we do have Pearl Islands. And I love Pearl Islands. It's one of my favorite seasons. I do think its cast is another one of these that is super top heavy though. Again, you got Sandra, Rupert, Johnny Fairplay. That's the big three of the season, three of the best characters of all time. Beyond that, most of the pre-merge boots are very forgettable. I mean, you got Nicole Delma, you got Skinny Ryan, you got a Michelle, you have a Sean, a Trish, again, all these people that aren't super memorable. Even Austin is really only memorable for his quit. Even in the post-merge, people like a Rhino doesn't get much to do. Dara gets a very subdued edit. Tijuana and Krista are kind of just fine. Bern and Lil both get pretty sizable edits and are fine. Savage is a really interesting figure across the season. But again, like to me, this is a cast that is super top heavy. You got some all-time great characters in Sandra Fairplay and Rupert that I think really make the season. But then you get a lot of non-factors that do weigh it down a bit. But it is still a iconic cast, a really notable cast that does make it stand out. And that's why it's as high as it is here at number 25. Number 24, moving on to another old school season. We're moving on to season 4, Marquesas, which again is another one, has some iconic characters. You got Kathy, you got Sean, you got John Carroll and his downfall. You got the first appearance of Boston Rob, who I think is someone that gets kind of overshadowed nowadays, where people talk about Boston Rob shouldn't have come back for All Stars. I think those people have not watched Marquesas recently. I think Boss Rob is the star of Marquesas up until his eventual boot. But again, it's not a problem of it being a very top-heavy cast. Beyond that, a lot of the pre-mergers are just fine. You got Patricia, who's kind of just there. Gina is kind of boring to me, even though she gets so much content. Sarah is obviously just notable for aesthetics. Hunter has a fun downfall, but in itself isn't that interesting of a character. Peter Harkey's fine. Gabriel Cade has a fun downfall, but it's like, again, kind of like a middling group of early boots. Then like post-merge, you got people like a Zoe in general who aren't the most riveting TV, but do have like little fun moments. Tammy is fine. And the end gamers like Pascal and Nalia are like not the most interesting TV, but they just play such a major impact on the season. And then Vesepia is like fine, where I feel like she's good in the first half of the season, but in the back half, she's not super notable until the finale outside of her relationship with Sean, which again, like Sean is an all-time great character here, but again, it's kind of a middling cast to me. some iconic characters, some people that despite making it far aren't super interesting. It's kind of in the same spot as Pearl Islands. And to be honest, the individual characters within Pearl Islands are probably more iconic, but I feel like for me, the Marquesas cast clicked with me a bit more outside of those big characters. So because that's here at number 24. Number 23, moving on to another cast very similar, and here we do have Survivor Africa. And Survivor Africa for me has the iconic characters of Ethan, Tom, and Lex. I think those are the big three. Beyond that, you have someone like a T-Bird who gets a bit of a subdued edit, but when she's on there, she's really good. Like, obviously the moment at the merge challenge and the entire stuff around the Lex vote, that's really great. She is someone that's actively playing the game, so at least there's that. Clarence is a big character. You have the fall of Lindsay and Silas, which is interesting. But then the rest are just kind of fine. Again, the Diane, Jesse Camacho, Charles of the world, Linda, even like a Kim Powers, who is a late boot, doesn't really get that much content. But again, like it's in the similar vein as the last few seasons. But when I think of the Africast, I think of it as a bit more iconic than I do Marquesas. So again, it's a slight bit above it, and it's here at number 23. Number 22, again, another cast that I don't even like this season that much. I've been very open about that, but I do think its cast is very iconic, which keeps it as high as it is, and that is Survivor, the Australian Outback. And again, Colby and Jerry come from the season, both iconic figures for the show. Tina Weston's obviously iconic. You got Varner and Scoopin, who are obviously now not well looked upon, but at the time were fascinating characters. You got Alicia, who's fun TV. Kimmy Kappenberg is fine. Roger and Elizabeth have an interesting dynamic. I mean, I feel like the propping up of this cast largely comes from the fact that it is the second season of the show, and the fact that Australian Outback was such a big phenomenon at the time that makes this cast feel more iconic to the history of the show, to where if it wasn't for that prestige that comes along with that, it probably would be a few spots lower. But again, like the legacies of Colby and Jerry and Tina and Alicia and Varner and Scoopin, it's enough. It's enough to land it above the last few old school seasons we've talked about, and it is here at number 22. And now we're jumping from these old school iconic casts to more recent casts, and we're actually going to be in a string of very recent casts, starting off at 21 here. One that could have potentially been higher had it not been for one massive downer, and that is the cast of Survivor Island of the Idols. And again, I think on paper, Island of the Idols is one of the best casts in recent history, had you taken out Dan Spilo. And Dan Spilo is obviously a massive knock against this, to where that instantly puts IOI at the bottom of this tier, to where if it wasn't for Dan, this would probably be a few spots higher. But even outside of that, I mean, there are a couple people who are non-factors. People like a Tom Laidlaw. Ronnie doesn't even get a big edit considering he is the first boot. Molly is someone that isn't particularly memorable. I mean, Vince, Chelsea Walker, Jason Linden, all have like fine edits and fun moments for early boots. But I feel like everyone from the merge on, with the exception of Dan Spilo, makes interesting TV. Again, kind of questionable on like Tommy and Elizabeth, but I always thought Erin was an interesting character on the show. Kelly Kim obviously brings a lot to the table, where she's such a massive player. Jamal is a really interesting character and likable presence. Missy plays the game really hard, and that was interesting to see. Elaine was such a big presence here. Karishma was a fun presence. Lauren was a solid player. Janet was really likable. Nora and Dean both had really ridiculous moments across the season. Again, I think this is a mostly solid cast, but Dan Spilo really drops everything, where if it wasn't for him, this would probably be like 5 spots higher or so. But again, I have to drop it quite a bit due to him and the overall negative taint he has on the season, and because that IOI is here at 21. Now, number 20, we're moving on to a cast that I think is another one that probably stands out as one of the lesser of recent Survivor casts, but I still do really like this one, and that is the cast of Survivor Edge of Extinction. Now, obviously a factor here is that this is the season that led to the firing of Lynn Spillman, where in the middle of the season's casting, she was fired. So that kind of leads to the cast being a bit of a mess here, and that is why we get these like random returnees here in Kelly, Joe, Aubrey, and David. But I feel like they did add to the season, with the exception of Joe, where Aubrey has a fun downfall. It was interesting to see David play again, and then Kelly has probably what is her best game. Yeah, I thought they brought stuff to the table. And also, I feel like despite the wonky editing of the season, I feel like we got to know a good chunk of this cast, largely due to them being in the game for longer on the edge of extinction. So people like a Reem and a Keith and a Wendy, I feel like we knew pretty well. I really liked War Dog and Ron Clark and Victoria and Lauren O'Connell. Rick Devens obviously has a fantastic story across the season that while I know some people get annoyed by him, I always found them really good TV. I think Chris's story also is really interesting, where again, I know that's also a fault of people with the seasons, how the winner just comes out of nowhere. But I think also, if you pay closer attention, the storyline that is set up there is pretty interesting, and for that to culminate in the finale, I think is really strong. Now, I will say that because of the Edge of Extinction twist, I do think it took away from some of the endgamers, where Gavin, Julie, Aurora, even Lauren, aren't given as much time as what they should have. But overall, I do like the Edge of Extinction cast more than most people, and because that lands here at number 20. Now, number 19, moving on to a cast that, again, I think this cast gets really applauded as one of the best modern casts, and I think it is a mixed bag. But at number 19, we do have the cast of Millennials versus Gen X. I think this is a couple of double-edged sword here, where I think it is a cast that the people that make it deep into the game, I think, are mostly memorable. I think they are mostly really notable figures from the likes of an Adam and a David Wright and a Ken, a Hannah, a Jay, a Zeke. However, I also feel like the earlier boots on the season are pretty big non-factors. I mean, Rachel and Cece are pretty forgettable. Lucy barely gets an edit. Paul Wachter is probably another one of the more forgettable figures in recent history. Even Mari Takahashi is just fine. You do get some pretty good late pre-merge boots in Figgy and Michaela, and then you have a Taylor who was a big character in the early post-merge. But I also feel like people like a Brett was probably under-edited. Sunday and Will both were extremely under-edited. And as a whole, I do feel like this cast kind of lacks a bit of something. It just feels a bit too game body to me. Where I know that's something that is a plot of Millennials Gen X, is that how when everyone gets voted out, they're all still cordial. There's no drama in between people. But I also feel like that's not super interesting to me to see people just say good job and then leave. To me, Millennials Gen X, it's a good cast, obviously. But I do feel like it's probably overstated on how good of a cast it is in my eyes. Because that's here at number 19. At number 18, moving on to another more recent cast. And here we do have one that, again, I personally like more than most people, and that is the cast of HHH. Now, again, I think HHH probably has more duds here. I mean, we do have JP. We do have Katrina. We do have even Simone, doesn't bring much to the table. But I think almost everyone else is pretty strong. I think particularly the endgamers, I think on this season are really good. Obviously, Ben, love him or hate him, is a major figure on this season. Chrissy and Ryan have a major impact here. Devin was a really interesting and surprising figure on the season, where surprised to see someone in his archetype do as well as he did. You got Dr. Mike, who's a fun character. Joe Mena is fun. Lauren Rimmer is fun. Ashley's fine. Cole was a big presence. Cole and Jessica were both big presences. Desi was kind of under-edited, even though she did come off as likable. I mean, you got someone like an Alan Ball, who was a big character that got booted early. Allie Elliott was a really likable figure. So again, I think I like this cast quite a bit, to where even though there are a couple major duds, I still think it's a pretty solid modern day cast, and it lands here at number 18. Now at number 17, moving back quite a bit, actually, 10 seasons, we're going all the way to Survivor Philippines. And this is kind of a weird cast for me, because I think this is a season that is a bit top heavy, where again, early on, I think there are a lot of duds that go home early. I mean, people like a Roxy doesn't bring much to the table. The three women on Calabaw and Katie, Dawson, and Dana are all pretty forgettable. Even an Angie is just fine. But then you have Zane Knight, who is a big character. You have Russell Swan, who has a fantastic arc across this season. But then we get to the post-merge where even then you have someone like an Artist who's kind of just there. Carter has some funny moments, but again, not super memorable. But beyond that, I think it's a really strong post-merge field. You got the likes of RC, Pete, Abby Maria is a fantastic character. Jeff Kent has a really fun downfall. Penner is obviously incredible on this season. Obviously, Scoopin is Scoopin, but still has a fun downfall across this season. Lisa has a fascinating arc. Denise has an interesting run where she goes to every tribal. And then you have Malcolm, who is extremely likable across this season. Again, I think it is a really strong cast, but probably has bigger duds along the way than the last couple seasons we talked about. but still, very notable cast for me, and it is here at number 17. Now number 16, and we're moving on to very recent history. We're getting to two of the most recent seasons in a row. At number 16, we do have Survivor 41. And 41, again, I think is a situation where I actually really like this cast. I actually think this is one of the better newbie casts of all time. However, I just don't feel like they were properly edited. I don't feel like they were properly shown to the audience. And I think through that, it does lessen the impact of this cast. When we have the likes of Erica and Heather having understated edits, even someone like a Danny isn't really that prominent. Xander doesn't come off as the most interesting character despite his popularity. But despite the things, I thought Deshaun had a fascinating arc across season. I think Ricard was a really great character. Liana brought a lot to the show. Obviously, Shan is the star of the show for a lot of it. And her eventual downfall was riveting TV. You got the likes of Evie and Tiffany, who I thought brought a lot to the table. Nasir was a fun character. I thought Sydney was a fun character. I think in terms of pre-mergers, JD and Brad both brought a lot to the table. I thought even like Sarah was a likable early boot, even though, again, not super notable in the grand scheme of things. Voce was more likable than I was expecting. Like, really, to me, the only true dud from this cast is Abraham, who was the first boot, and really it's mostly like he just didn't get much to do. I think most of the rest of the cast is pretty strong, again, like outside maybe like a Heather where like just the edit was not there for her. But I do really like this cast. I think this is a cast that could have been an all-time great cast had it been portrayed a bit differently. But considering I do have to factor in how they were edited across the show into this cast ranking, as it does obviously impact how entertaining they were on the show, I do still have to land them here at number 16. Now number 15, right above them, again, really connected to me, we do have Survivor 42. And I've said this at the time that I did my review, I think 41 and 42 are very similar cast-wise. I think the difference is obviously 42 does a better job at utilizing its cast in the edit. I think it does a better job at characterization, and through that ends up being a spot higher here. But I do think as a whole, again, I think there are things that 41 does better. I think 41's cast is more game savvy as a whole. I think 41's cast is more bitter at each other as a whole. I mean, like for me, I know that's something that people like about these casts, the casts that get along and these casts that have camaraderie. I personally don't care. I don't care if they're friends. I don't care if they take their blind sides well. Like, that is something that is not particularly interesting to me. Like, from a TV product standpoint, I would rather have this bitterness that we saw from 41 than this overall happy-go-lucky attitude that 42 exudes. That being said, again, there are fantastic characters here. Obviously, you got Marianne, all-time great character. Got the likes of Mike and Omer, who I thought brought a lot to the table. Dre and Hai were like big presences across the season, though I never found them particularly entertaining. Jonathan has a complex arc across the season. Lindsay's someone that like starts off pretty dull, but then starts to get a storyline through a rivalry with Jonathan that becomes more interesting. But really, I think a difference here again between this and 41, I think the pre-mergers are not as strong to me. Where pre-mergers of 42, I think really Daniel's the only one that truly stands out. Everyone else is just everyone else is mostly forgettable there, outside of Jenny and how screwed over she was. Even the early post-mergers, I think, are not the most riveting TV, and like a Roxroy, Chanel, Lydia barely got any screen time. So again, like I think there are definitely things that 41's cast does better, but I think in terms of how they were portrayed on the show, I think 42's is definitely better portrayed, and because of that, they were one spot higher at number 15. Now number 14, we're on the final of these more modern casts that are all in a row. And at 14, we have a cast I think is a bit controversial. I think this is a cast that most people don't like in the modern day, but I've always personally liked them, even though there is some ickiness within it, and that is the cast of Survivor Worlds Apart. And again, I thought this was a great cast at the time. I still do enjoy it now. Now, there are a few people who are kind of duds. I mean, you got like Kelly Remington, who is kind of boring. Nina doesn't bring much to the table. Lindsay is fine. But, I mean, you still got some notable pre-mergers in like a Vince and a Max. While Haley doesn't bring much to the table, I thought she was still a likable presence and someone that I was happy to see get a second chance eventually in Game Changers. I think you get some all-time great characters in like a Mike and a Rodney and a Dan Foley, who again, I know are not the most liked figures in the Survivor community, but I do think Rodney brings a lot to the show, and I think Dan Foley is one of the most humorous figures in all of Survivor, especially when you look at it under the context of how much of a doofus the show makes him out to be. The likes of Shireen and Jen bring a lot to the table. Joe, even though again, Not the greatest figure nowadays, but at the time I think was an interesting golden boy figure where he actually tries to play the game in Worlds Apart, so that's something. I think the Worlds Apart cast is for the most part pretty strong. I overall liked most of the cast. And to be honest, would have considered putting it higher had it not been for this like kind of icky nature that surrounds certain members of the cast, particularly around Rodney and then the Will and Shireen stuff. But as a whole, I do still like this cast. It's here number 14. Now number 13, and here we're moving on to some middle school seasons of the show. And at 13 here is a cast that I think on paper is not as good as its placement here, but there's some all-time great characters here, and most of the cast is solid, and that is the cast of Survivor Panama. And again, this is a weird one where there are a lot of duds in the pre-merge, to where I think that you could make the argument that this should be below these modern seasons I just ran through. Where again, the early boots here, you have the likes of a Melinda and a Ruth Marie who don't bring much to the table. Nick Stanberry's really boring. You have even like a Timbertina doesn't bring that much to the show. I've always liked Misty Giles, even though she doesn't bring the most entertainment there. I thought she was a likable presence. I liked Bob Dog. I thought Dan Fuego was a very humorous figure in his constant talk about how he's an astronaut. And then once we get to the post-merge, once Nick Stanberry is gone, and I guess take out Sally too, I think it's a pretty strong field. I mean, like, Austin is maybe not the most riveting TV, but he's always someone that I've personally had a fondness for. And then beyond that, again, it's a lot of really great characters where we're left with Kasaya plus Terry. And again, Terry Dietz, really great underdog arc across the season, really great downfall as well. And then you have the Kasaya tribe, which is one of the most train-wrecky tribes ever. You got Bruce and his medevac, which is just hilarious, even though, again, it's really sad he's getting medevac. But again, the actual scene itself is kind of funny. You have Courtney and Shane, who are really wacko characters, but really great TV. Daniel DeLorenzo, I think, is kind of understated as a good character on this season, with her getting into a lot of arguments. Aris is more boring, but still, I think the rest are able to pick up the slack for him. And then obviously you got Suri, who is an all-time great character here, but also a really impressive player. So I feel like Panama is able to be better than the sum of its parts, where there are some duds that are on the cast, particularly that were booted early, but I do think a lot of the endgamers are really strong. That accelerates the season here to number 13. Number 12, we have a similar case with another middle school season of the show, and here we do have Survivor Tocantins. And again, this is another season, a decent amount of duds early on. I mean, you got the likes of a Jerry, a Spencer, a Sydney, a Carolina, even Candace. Like, they don't bring much to the table. I mean, you got Sandy, who is a fun character. But outside of that, the pre-merges are kind of boring. Joe, we can add it to that as well. But I think everyone from the Final 9 on is pretty good TV. I really like the Final 9. Where at that point, we have Sierra, who has a really fun underdog storyline. We have Brendan, who has a really fun downfall. We have Debbie, who's probably the least interesting of the bunch, but at least has some fun character moments. We have Tyson, who has a great downfall and also gives snarky confessionals. We have Coach, who is an all-time great character. We have Taj, who is a likable presence. We have Aaron, who is also kind of a scrappy underdog there. And then we have JT and Steven, who are one of the strongest duos in the history of the show, and both really likable presences across the season as well. So again, like, I just think the final 9 of this cast are really, really strong. So while the pre-mergers outside of like Sandy are mostly forgettable, I do think it makes up for it, and I think Tocantins ends up being one of the better casts here at number 12. Now number 11, and here we are at the last all-newbie middle school season of the show. And it's a cast that I do think as a whole is pretty consistently strong. I don't think there's a single complete non-entity on the cast. And at number 11, we do have Survivor China. And again, like, I think this is a mostly strong cast. I think even the early boots in like a Chicken and an Ashley Mazzaro, a Dave Cruiser, Leslie, I think all these people bring something to the table. Dave in particular is like an insane character. Even though Aaron isn't the most interesting TV, I think he has a really fun downfall. Sharia has her moments. Probably Eric is the most boring of the post-mergers, but I think outside of that, everyone else is pretty good TV. Jamie has a really fun downfall with the fake idol. John Robert is an insane character. James is a really iconic character across this season. PG is a scrappy underdog. Denise has her moments. Maybe not the most likable presence, but is at least notable. And then you got Amanda, who is probably not the most interesting in the world, but at least has some interesting gameplay along the way. Courtney obviously has great one-liners, and then we got Todd, who is really great TV, but is also a great player to bat. Again, I think this is a pretty consistent cast through and through. One of the better newbie casts in the history of the show, and for that, it lands here at number 11. And now we're at the top 10, and we are starting off the top 10 with the oldest season left on the board, the very first season, and here we do have Survivor Borneo. And again, for me, I feel like Survivor Borneo's cast is so iconic that it would be tough to not put this high, especially when it's still a very solid cast. I mean, yeah, there are some pre-merges that aren't as impactful as others. Obviously, we got Dirk, who I think is a non-factor. I don't think Ramona gets much to really do. Stacy, even though I think in retrospect, you can credit her for like the creation of the alliance and everything. Not super notable on the show. But even then, like Sonia, who's an early boot, I think gets decent screen time considering she's booted in the first episode. BB has a fun few episodes. Joel has an interesting downfall. And I think once we get to the merge, like everyone from that point on is pretty memorable. And we got Gretchen, who is the leader of Pagong, gets taken out in that plurality vote. We got Greg, who's an incredible character. Jenna has some notable moments. Jervis is a mixed bag, definitely has some questionable behavior at points, but overall, notable figure. Colleen was America's sweetheart at the time. You have Sean, who is this massive doofus, but has some fun moments through that. Kelly Wigglesworth has this great arc at the very end that leads to her downfall. And then we got really iconic characters in Richard Hatch, Rudy, and we got Suhawk, who all have massive presences across this season. And for me, Borneo's cast is just so iconic, but also still very strong in its own right. It's here at number 10. Now, number 9, we're going to be on a string of seasons that do have returnees. Out of the top 9 here, only 3 of them are all newbie casts. But first, we're starting off with an all returnee season here. And ironically, this is a cast that was picked by America themselves. And here we do have Survivor Cambodia, which ironically is a cast that is picked by America themselves, though despite that, it's actually the second lowest all-star season on this list. But I still think Cambodia is obviously a strong cast. I mean, you got some really great returns from Jeremy, Spencer, and Kelly Wentworth. Tasha's a bit of a mixed bag across season, but still, I think overall had a pretty solid run. You got the likes of Stephen Fishback, who has a fall and downfall. Savage is probably a better character than I remembered. Abby Maria is Abby Maria. Sierra has a fun arc. Jeff Varner, again, say what you will about Jeff Varner and Game Changers, but has a really fun few episodes on Cambodia here. And overall, it's a cast that is good. I mean, like, for an all-star season, I think it's kind of just middle of the road. Obviously, in the grand scheme of things, it's a good cast, though. Like, I do think someone like a Kimmy was under-edited. Even Keith was kind of under-edited. Monica is someone that didn't bring much to the table. Some of the earlier boots and like Shireen and Vetus, they didn't get that much to do either. But I think as a whole, again, it's still a solid cast. It's an all-star cast, which I think inherently gives it a bit of an advantage in the sense that we already know all these people. There's already these like built-in story arcs for their returns. But to me, this ends up being one of the lesser all-star casts, and because that does land here at number 9. Now, number 8, moving on to 2 mixed casts back-to-back. And first one we're going through here at number 8 is Survivor Blood versus Water, which, to be honest, the weakest field here is the returnees. I think the family members on Blood vs. Water are the best part of the season. We get some really great loved ones on this season. I mean, you get Hayden Moss, you get Sierra, who obviously has a massive presence. Caleb was a really likable presence. Brad Culpepper was a massive character in the pre-merge. Even John Cody was a pretty big character in the pre-merge. Katie ends up being a somewhat likable character. Marissa has a fun, like, early boot trajectory. Like, I feel like there are a lot of really good loved ones. And it's really the returnees that are kind of more of a mixed bag, where you do have the likes of, I mean, obviously Colton, who quits, which is, like, really underwhelming. But even beyond that, someone like an Aris, who, I mean, like, really his connection to Vetus is what's really interesting. But Aris as an individual, not the most interesting figure in the world. I don't think Tina brought that much to the show here. I think Laura Metz in this similar case of like her being interesting because of Sierra. Like, really, I think the vets were the weaker field here. But even then, like, I think Jervis brought some humor to the show. You have Monica Culpepper, who had a really fascinating arc across the show. Obviously, you have Tyson and him eventually winning, and that's interesting. I do think as a whole, this is a pretty strong cast. So because that still lands here at number 8. Now, number 7, we're on to a cast that, again, another half and half season, but I think one that does both sides of the fence pretty well, and that is Survivor Micronesia. which I think this is one of the most consistent casts in the history of the show. Really, I think the only true dud on this cast is Mary. I think everyone else brings something to the table. I think all the favorites here are pretty good picks. I mean, obviously, I think Amanda was probably a big question mark, maybe Parvati, but obviously they make it to the end and have big runs on this season. But like almost everyone else is the who's who of the non-winners of this era of Survivor. You got Eliza and Amy, who are big characters on Vanuatu. You also got Fairplay, which ends underwhelmingly, but again, still really great to get Fairplay back here. You have Suri back. You have Ozzy and Penner back. You have James back. You have Yowman back. Like, that's an incredible group of returning players there. But then to mix that in with a decent batch of newbies, where I think the Joel-Mikey B rivalry was really interesting. You have the humor of Chet being around. You have Tracy, who's a solid player. You have Kathy, who's an interesting character. You have Alexis and Natalie, who are kind of quiet early on, but become more prominent by the end. And Natalie in particular becomes this like big villain for the show by the end of it. Jason Siska has a really fun downfall and is a bit of a doofus. Eric Reichenbach obviously is a really iconic figure here. Like, I mean, it is a great cast all around that, despite being a fans versus favorites season, which I think you would think would lead to the fans being outclassed by the favorites, I think this is a season that is able to avoid that. And through that, for me, lands here at number 7. And now number 6, and we are getting to the last newbie seasons on the board. Again, we are at the final 6. Here we have 3 newbie seasons, 3 all-star seasons, and spoiler alert, the 3 all-star seasons are at the top. But let's run through the final newbie seasons. At number 6, the third best newbie season in my eyes is Survivor David versus Goliath. And again, David vs. Goliath is another cast that I think is very consistent. Now, I do think there are probably a couple of duds here, which I don't think there are in my top 2 newbie seasons, where here you do have someone like a Jessica Pete, you have a B, who both don't really bring much to the table. Even in the endgamers, someone like a Cara and an Allison don't get as big of an edit as what they could have. But I think the rest of the cast is pretty strong. I mean, Pat Cusick, despite being medevac in the first episode, we're able to get to know him pretty well. Jeremy has an interesting downfall. We have Natalia, who's a great character and has a great downfall as well. Natalie is a fantastic character throughout the entire pre-merge here. Lyrsa has her moments. Elizabeth has her moments. John Hennigan has this massive blind side, but is also this like really fun figure in confessionals. You have Dan Rengering, who has a great downfall. Alec was a surprise, considering he's this like generic like surfer bro, but turns out to be a really aggressive strategic player. Carl is someone that starts off a bit slow, but by the end of it becomes an interesting player that has this really fun downfall as well. I always found Gabby super likable. Christian's an all-time great character. Davey is an all-time great character. And the final 3 here is all really strong, where Nick and Mike both play pretty strong games and had some fun content throughout. And then you have Angelina, who's another all-time great character. Again, it is a pretty great cast. I mean, Angelina, Davey, Christian are all-time great characters here. And it's a mostly consistent group of players, one of the best grouping of players in recent history. So for me, it's here at number 6. Now, number 5, we have a season that I think is probably forgotten about as an all-time great cast. I think this is a cast that is very consistent. I don't think there's a single true dud on the board, and there's also some really iconic characters that come from it. So at number 5, I do have Survivor Kaoh Rong. And Kaoh Rong, to me, again, like, is an incredible cast. Like, there is no single dud on this cast. Like, while yes, there is someone like a Liz who's maybe forgettable at the end of the day, I feel like Darnell is a pretty great first boot. I feel like Jennifer has a really fun downfall. Caleb obviously gets a massive edit through his evacuation, but you get Alicia, who also has a really big arc. Peter gets propped up as this big villain as well. Anna Kate, again, say what you will now, but at least at the time seemed to be this really savvy player. Nick is someone that starts off a bit quiet, but then his edit props up by the end. Neil is probably just kind of but at least has like a heartbreaking exit from the game. Debbie is obviously a fantastic character. Scott Pollard ends up being a really fantastic villain for the show, and to go along with that, Jason ends up being a fantastic villain as well. 2 of the best villains in recent Survivor history in my eyes. Julia ends up being a solid player, especially considering her age. Joe is someone that I would say is probably like kind of close to a dud, where if it wasn't for the fact that he made it so far, I think he would be forgettable. But I think the Final Four is an incredible Final Four. You have Michelle, who I think at the time would have been an underwhelming winner, but I think like now with her returning for Winners at War and being a more prominent figure in the community, I think that's obviously something to factor in here. And then again, you have Aubrey, Ty, Sydney, 3 fantastic characters, 3 all-time great characters across this season. Also 3 very solid players as well. So I feel like Kaoh Rong's is a very consistent cast here, one of the best casts in Survivor history as well. So for me, it lands here at number 5. Now, number 4, we have the best newbie cast in my eyes. That again, personal bias here, considering this is also my favorite season of the show. But at number 4, I do have Survivor Cagayan. Where again, like I think this is another cast. I don't think there's a single true dud on this cast. Maybe Lindsay. I think Lindsay is probably one you can argue, considering she quits, and before that, really most of her content's around her bashing Trish, which even then, that's somewhat entertaining. Maybe you can argue Alexis, considering she doesn't really do that much, but she's always a player that I thought had some potential. But outside that, I think everyone else brings something to the table. I mean, David Sampson's a great first boot. Garrett has a massive blind side. That's really fun. Bryce was a fun presence. Jatia also has a great downfall. It has some fantastic character moments throughout, obviously with her like dumping the rice and just pissing off her entire tribe. You have Cliff Robinson, who comes off as a really likable figure and has this big blind side. Sarah Lucina is a massive figure in the pre-merge of the season. See her eventual downfall is fantastic and one of the best tribals in the history of the show. Morgan is a really humorous figure that, while she wasn't that into the game, again, brought a lot of humor to the show. LJ, while not the most interesting personality, was at least a massive player. Jeremiah had some humorous moments. I think he was probably a better player than people remember. Jeffra, same thing, had some humorous moments and also ended up being pretty important to her last few rounds. And then we have the final 6, which I think is a really iconic final 6. I mean, you got Tasha, who has a massive underdog arc and really likable across this season. You have Trish, who, again, a very argumentative figure, but also someone that was interesting to see her dynamic with Tony. We have Spencer, massive underdog, very likable figure, fan favorite from the time. We have Cass, who really is one of the figures that makes the season. And while I disagree with her gameplay and her overall approach to the game, it still makes for riveting TV. You have Wu, who is a likable presence and obviously has some interesting decisions towards the end game. And then you have Tony, who is an all-time great character, all-time great player. I get all around really great cast. Don't think there's a single true dud here. Best newbie cast in my eyes. It's here number 4. Now number 3, we're moving on to, again, the final 3 here are all All-Star seasons. But we're starting off at number 3 here with the original Survivor All-Stars, which, again, I think is a good cast as a whole. I think considering the first 7 seasons they had to work with and the amount of people that said yes, I think they got most of the big names that they could have wanted. Like, obviously, there are some question marks on people like a Jenna and an Amber, but I think most of this cast is pretty much the who's who of this era of Survivor. Now, I do think there is an element of the Game Changers issue of the formatting of the cast not being ideal, where obviously there's a big discrepancy between like all the winners and people like a Boston Rob and Jenna, who were like earlier boots. But I still feel like for the first All-Star season, I feel like they did the best job that they could have here. I think this is a pretty strong cast that, while again, I personally would probably make a couple changes, this is still an iconic group of players. I mean, we still got 4 of the winners back here. Then you got Rudy and Sue, you got Colby, you got Jerry, you have Ethan, Lex, and Tom. You have Kathy back. You have Rob Cesternino. You have Rupert. I mean, it is pretty much the who's who of this era of Survivor. And that is something that obviously elevates it. And while the actual season as a whole ends up being underwhelming, I don't really knock that against the cast itself. So because that, for me, considering the legacy of this cast, it is here at number 3. Now, number 2, we're moving on to another All-Star season that, while I think the legacy of this cast is probably like a step below All-Stars, especially considering the era of the show, I do think the way the season played out and the way that these people were used was a lot more interesting to me. So at number 2, we do have heroes versus villains. And again, I think this comes from a situation where final 3 is Sandra, Parvati, and Russell. 3 of the best characters of the season. 3 really iconic figures for the show at this point. And even beyond that, you have a lot of really interesting endgamers here. You have Jerry and Colby both make it to the final 5. You have Rupert be a massive antagonistic figure for Russell on this season. You have JT, who has a massive presence across the season as well. Even someone like Candace, who doesn't have the biggest edit in the world, at least has this major storyline of flipping at the merge. You have some great pre-merge boots. In Coach, who has a fascinating arc across this season. You have Boston Rob and his rivalry with Russell, which is fantastic. James ends up being a very different figure than where he was on the last few seasons, but was still pretty interesting TV to me. You have Tom, who has to play from the underdog position. That was really interesting to see. You have Sari back once again. You have Stephanie here. Like, it definitely is a very strong cast all around. Again, I do think the editing kind of underserved certain people like a Courtney and a Tyson, but also I feel like the actual events of the season did prop up the cast to where we got more of these really iconic figures that a lot of them did make it towards the end. So again, I do think as a whole, one of the best casts of all time, and because that lands here at number 2. Now number 1, again, when I started the video saying that legacy is definitely going to play a factor into this, that's a lot of why this cast is at number 1. The number 1 cast of all time for me is Survivor Winners at War. Again, I have complaints with this cast. I've talked about numerous times on previous videos. However, the concept of having 20 winners come back for this big anniversary season and for them to get almost every big name that they wanted to get, I think that alone is very impressive. I mean, like, outside of like Richard Hatch and maybe Tina, I feel like they got the who's who of Survivor out of this casting pool. And while yes, I personally would have liked to see like a Todd or an Earl or maybe a Vesepia, it's like, this is still an incredible cast. I mean, the fact that they got Boston Rob back, the fact that they got Parvati back, the fact that they got Ethan back, the fact that we saw the return of Danny Boatwright, we saw the return of Yule, which is, again, just insane that some of these people end up coming back. But also mix that with some of the all-time great winners from recent seasons in a Tony and Natalie Anderson and a Jeremy. We got to see this underdog return from Michelle. We got to see the returns of Kim Spradlin and Sophie Clark, these people who I've been wanting to see back for a while. We also got to see the return of Cops R Us and see their dynamic again. And like, really, for me, I feel like Winners at War just feels like a celebration of Survivor's history, not just in how the actual season played out and how it was presented, but also in terms of the casting. Again, the casting here for this anniversary season is really what props up the season, so to not recognize that by declaring them as the best cast of all time would feel like a disservice to me, especially considering the overall legacy of this cast. And for me, I do have to put them here at number 1. So there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of every cast in Survivor history. Now down the road, I would like to do a different version of this list where I'm solely ranking them based on gameplay. I think that would be an interesting list down the road. Obviously, just expect more Survivor Big Brother videos as well. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.